Hello and welcome to another episode of the Rippling Pages podcast. Great writers making waves with the word, all in conversation with me, Liam Bishop. And it's part 2 of our Flit Eye special, and this week I'm joined by Samatar Elmi. Samatar is a poet, PhD candidate and educator. His debut collection, Portrait of Colossus, is, among many other things, a musical and rhythmical examination of identity. Samatar takes influence from contemporary political events, antiquity and Somali, oral history to not only question how we make sense of our world, but poetry's capacity to articulate experience.
The collection is called A Portrait of Colossus, and you often give us images of scaling or climbing heights in your poems. I just wanted to start by talking about this idea of Colossus.
The idea of empire and notions of kind of colonization and the fallout, the post-colonial fallout that kind of, has had a massive impact on many people's lives. I think everybody's life, whether we all appreciate it or not, but certainly in a very immediate and intimate sense in my life, seems almost like this strange monolithic, edifice that is difficult to really comprehend, almost statuesque. And I revisit it a lot really in this collection. I think that kind of happened initially quite unconsciously, just returning to the myths and the founding stories of what has become Western civilization. The idea of this massive statue, which inevitably is lost to history. It gets lost in an earthquake, but was this symbol of great Western power. The symbol of that really kind of brought me to want to write about it, I think.
Yeah, because Colossus was this great big statue, was it, on the island of Rhodes, I think it was. And it's become an image then of empire and colonialization. And the way your relationship to it is quite I don't want to say it's confused from your perspective, it's confused from the kind of reader's perspective. Sometimes you are kind of looking up at this thing and you're kind of wondering how to scale it and climb it. And other times you're kind of at a distance to it. And sometimes you associate heights with an uncertainty. Sometimes it looks like it's an ascent, a place to reach, but also it seems like an unattainable ideal as well. I want to scale his limbs at great heights, all languages are blur. And it's this reference to the Tower of Babel and language. So how does that then tie into the art of poetry and then stepping out of these ideas about colonialization to write a collection sort of about something with this great big theme?
It's funny because I think particularly at the stage I'm at with my writing, it's very unconscious. And often I read, Don Paterson describe the whole process of interpretation as being one in which once the poet is done with the writing of the thing and has put it out in the world, then it's up to everybody else to kind of excavate the meaning that jumps out at them. And often it's not the same as what the author might initially have intended. And I feel that's happened a few times with people I've spoken to about this collection, and they've picked up on things that perhaps wasn't immediately in the forefront of my mind. So I say that almost as a caveat, really, to answering your question, because I don't feel I have all the answers to what I'm trying to put forward. It's more for sort of feelings, really, often. One of the things I think that I find so fascinating about this symbol of a statue and kind of Western power or Western civilization, whether it be through the lens of colonization or just Western civilization writ large, is that there are a lot of things to admire. There is often this tension in the children of colonized people who were displaced by that power and had a lot of their autonomy, the trajectory of history radically altered. Is that there have been positives, and it's like that tension always remains. I mean, I worked in the Middle East as a ESL teacher for many years, and I was very conscious of the fact that I was a soft power, post-colonial agent for the British, really, though we were doing a lot of good. So like this constant tension, and I think I try and play with that at various parts in the collection. There's the poem "Rum," where I'm challenging my parents, who want me to be more traditional and want me to be more Somali and more kind of orthodox about the way I practice my religion, etc. But it's like how can that be possible when I've been raised in the West? You can't pick and choose how you've been influenced once you've been raised somewhere. Traditionally was for centuries was a very Sufi form of Islam, and as with most places, they've kind of had a strong influence from kind of Saudi orthodoxy. There's a lot of tension with looking at this statue. You have to, you are faced with the need to want to scale it to get that perspective that comes with civilization. And then I think also I felt as if the immigrant himself was a colossus.
Family is from Somalia. You were born in London, and the tensions, because there is a lot about, there's a contrast between height and kind of a solid footing, and that's a phrase that you do use. And I love this idea of footing, both in the sense of groundedness, feet on the ground, being in the world, but also poetry and feet and metrics. And one of the things you do write a lot about is trees. And this gives you a kind of great perspective of something, again, tall, giant, but also roots and visible roots as well. And I'm not sure if that tension plays out in this imagery.
So for me, civilization contrasts not only with culture, but it also contrasts somewhat with nature. And civilization is this thing that's very specific to the region. There's built environments and things that which come to play there, and which can often be very alienating. Whereas I feel like there's something about nature which is all inclusive, and I try and explore some of that, because I think the most British I've ever felt, or the most English I've ever felt, is just camping, or climbing a hill, or climbing a mountain, or just sitting around some trees, and and sitting in the park. And I feel that anywhere I go, if I'm in Spain, if I'm in Africa, wherever I am in Africa, it's the nature that feels inclusive. It doesn't ask you any questions. It's happy you're there. You can enjoy its beauty. You can engage in and participate in the wonder of the spectacle. Whereas I think civilization is alienating for all of us, not just me in my particular post-colonial experience, but I speak to a lot of my friends who wouldn't identify with any other particular ethnicity other than being British or English or Welsh or whatever, and they feel very alienated by modern life. So it's just bringing that tension into focus as well.
Jason Allen Paterson, the Carcanet poet. I don't know if you've read any of his work.
No, I haven't.
His essays written in the latest Peer Review. I'm just going to read. Where the relationship between blackness, nature, and history is concerned, a few observations are necessary. I will state these badly. Firstly, in disrupting relationships with nature, brackets, dwelling practices, colonialism disrupts ways of knowing the world, knowledge practices. Secondly, the work of coloniality is based on control over nature. Thirdly, part of that control is control of the othered, dangerous, out of place, to be controlled, black body. Just this idea of nature and how it, its sense of ownership. It just really struck me on some of the things you're saying, actually.
Well, thank you so much, Leo, because, oh, wow, that is just articulated for me in just way more accurately than I've ever managed to do or have read elsewhere. What I've kind of been driving at in many of these poems, I think the Manuel Cortez and the Immortal Tree poem is just about that. It's about how colonial forces and kind of the civilizationary impulse right? Towards progression, towards infinite rationality of processes, and until until eventually, us as being irrational beings, we're at the point now where we are now surplus to requirements, where this human being is going to be the next thing to be removed out of the equation. We see it now with automation in kind of the employment sphere. We're next, as in this ever increasing control to colonize or to civilize nature. And I kind of tried to use the bonsai tree as a allegory for this process that I just haven't been able to articulate as well as Jason has done.
Well, it's interesting you say manual cortex, because it's a bonsai tree that you talk about here, and bonsai is obviously a lot smaller than an oak tree, for argument's sake. And so how then do you bring these very global concerns, very historical concerns, very concerning concerns, how do you bring these back into a poem? How do you, how are you trying to articulate? I guess we see how you articulate these concerns because we get the poem, but there is a kind of sense of anxiety of craft within that poem, I thought. So how do you, how are they sort of coalescing into the poem?
I think there was, this poem is probably the oldest poem in the collection. So when we're talking about craft, it's the one that demonstrates my most infantile kind of command over craft, of all these poems. But I think I tried to capture something about there was a sense in, during the Renaissance that, it's going to get really loud. Can you hear the call to prayer now?
Is that what that is? Is that the
yeah.
Well, for listeners, that is the call to prayer in the background, because Samatar is in Somalia at the moment.
So yeah, I think in that position, I tried to kind of juxtapose almost like two voices.
Let's go to the poem. Is it's about a mastery, and then it's kind of, you take this symbol of a bonsai tree and you contrast it with these great historic events. And when you speak about the Lisbon earthquake, you kind of undercut yourself and go with a sort of, I think it's a little sort of sense of having tongue in cheek, but you go, it reminded me of Lisbon before the earthquake, the horrors of the untamed. And the horrors of the untamed is something that does seem to point to quite an existential concern for you. And it's, how do we tame, how do I bring this back into a kind of poem, or how do I craft this, all these, concerns maybe?
A very immediate concern that we're at an important juncture in the history of the human race and of the planet. I might refer a lot to previous mythologies and kind of ancient or distant histories, but I'm hoping that readers will get a sense that I'm trying to make the point that these concerns exist today, perhaps at a more, it's immediate, it's in front of us. We're faced by so many of these choices, as a civilization. Do we want to continue taming the world around us, or do we need to go back to a more sustainable model of engaging with nature?
Do hope you're enjoying the Rippling Pages podcast. If you'd like to keep up to date with the Rippling Pages, why don't you follow it on Instagram at rippling_pages. And if you'd like to get in touch with the Rippling Pages podcast, you can email ripplingpagespod@gmail.com. That's ripplingpagespod@gmail.com.
So how does that feel as a poet then? What kind of, thinking of the statue of Colossus, I think it's a great big, figure and representation of power. And we talked about colonial power. How does it feel as a poet, tackling these concerns?
The tradition of the poet, wherever you go in the world, at the root of that, of the need for any kind of culture or community to have this tradition is to mark events and is to provide meaning in an eloquent way. When I look at the Somali tradition that I'm very blessed to have access to, when I look at the European tradition that I'm very blessed to have access to, and then other traditions elsewhere, like the griot tradition of West Africa is one that I've been very interested by recently, and tried to kind of absorb a lot of lessons from. The poet is always the one who takes it upon him or herself to observe and comment, observe, interpret, and comment. And at some point, certainly in my development, I understood that duty was important from a very early age. Really, I just didn't realize that craft was also critically important. Otherwise, you're a journalist, so, or a historian. And so I think it's kind of balancing those two things, observing the world around you and providing a medium to discuss those issues, but not forgetting that it has to be art as well.
Well, you do pay attention to craft. You pay particular attention to musicality of your poetry. You use internal and end rhymes. You observe meter and scansion. But along with this, you do actually also appear to have an extensive knowledge of music, or definitely a big interest in music. So I wondered, what's the relationship between music and poetry for you?
I've always developed both the art forms in parallel, and not really seen them as being, certainly in my creative output, in my creative expression. I've not really seen the distinction as being one that is about the differences rather than the similarities in process, similarities of what you're aiming for, what you're hoping to achieve, what it takes. Hip hop is a very obvious crossover point between poetry and music, but I can think of so many other genres, like Bob Dylan, Subterranean Homesick Blues is rap. Jazz, you could listen to jazz and learn so much about meter, that you could apply directly to poetry. And I think jazz has been incredibly influential, in the 20th century for the development of poetry.
Well, From a Father to a Daughter is a poem where you do reference musical terms, poetic terms. You use musical symbols, notation as a start of stanzas. I mean, it's about the relationship of a father and a daughter. Final line is, "Now you decorate the walls of our temple with icons, scribbles, our family in sticks, as if to hold our hands through the growing and teach us both how to write a poem." To say, it probably sounds a lot better if you say that me reading your poetry.
But anyway, I mean, it's just East Yorkshire to West Yorkshire, isn't it? So it's not a massive difference in accents.
So what's going in there? What you've talked about a dialectic before, not necessarily here, but where does the poem intersect with that for you, for your work?
The first line of that poem, where my wife has asked me where the poems are that I've written. Have I written any poems about our daughter? That actually happened, and that was what that first line was. The first line I wrote the poem, because that was the prompt, and it was. I'd started hundreds of poems, about Miriam. None of them were satisfying enough. None of them could capture the scale of what she meant to me and the impact she'd had on my life. And yeah, it just every attempt wasn't hitting the mark. But in doing so, it allowed me to kind of express what we'd come through to get to the point where we were both, my wife and I were very young when we had her, and Miriam, she wasn't very well at first, and it was just a lot of a lot of really tough times. We didn't have, I wasn't working at the time. There wasn't a lot of money coming in. Just a real like struggle time, to be honest. And she's the one that kept it all together, really. And I think that the poem is just a homage to her, and her impact on us. She's the one, like that came from me and my wife, and the process, the struggle, and even in the poem, I can't write the poem, but she's teaching us how to live this very poetic life, kind of thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, you wouldn't get the kind of the full backstory just from reading the poem. There's a real sort of come together, and there's a real joy and light that comes out of the poem, and for listeners to get that insight as to who Miriam is.
Definitely.
I don't know if this is sort of related to this, but you seem to write, as I read the collection, I started to notice that you were writing quite a lot about youth or even sort of infancy, which could either be your infancy or the people's. You mentioned you have a daughter. And on some occasions, you actually explicitly write about birth as well. In Your Mother is a Different Language, you call the umbilical cord a first and last line of unbroken communication tossed into a medical waste bin. What's the significance of a line like this? And
the other, if we come down from that kind of macro level observation of post-colonialism, colonialism and empire and all of that, and then come down to what it is to live in the diaspora and what it is to be a British Somali family living in the UK, that most likely with parents who experienced the war, escaped a very brutal war, and then settled in a country where, again, most likely they didn't learn the language, they didn't know the language, they didn't know the culture or the customs, and to raise children in that environment, has been incredibly difficult. A phenomenon that exists in the British Somali community, where you do get you sometimes get parents who speak Somali and children who speak English in the same household, right? And the kids can't speak Somali very well, and the parents can't speak English very well / at all. But then at the level of cultural understanding, the gulf is even wider, between the generations. And this has meant that, it's made it incredibly difficult to integrate. It's made it incredibly difficult to survive, to get on, to do well, to have any kind of self-esteem, and in the immediate family dynamic, it's made it very difficult for there to be understanding and compassion between the generations. And so the last line of unbroken communication being the umbilical cord, that was the last time they were fully connected, in this kind of poetic scenario. It's an exaggeration, but I think it's an important one to stress that once child has left the womb and has entered the world, they're already being conditioned for a completely different way of living life. One that the parent has very little access to, and we have next to no access to their experience. The things that have informed their belief systems and their value structures.
So has this been a way then, has poetry been a way for you to access a language that or a connection that might have been discarded or lost somewhere a long time ago?
I knew from being about 13, 14 that I needed to write poetry. I just didn't really fully understand why. I think for me, poetry was a very safe space where I could explore identity. In any individual is burdened with a whole bunch of dogmas and conditions that are placed as just by being a member of that society. But when you come from like a dual heritage or a mixed background, you don't get half of each. You get all of both. Usually, what happens is you become an expert in ventriloquism or performance. You take a caricature of what it is to be English, or a caricature of what it is to be Somali, or a caricature of what it is to be Muslim, or a caricature of what it is to be, and you exaggerate that and magnify that to belong. Or from all my childhood, I felt like I was juggling. Just I'd be at home, and then it's when I've got the Somali ball in hand, right? And then if I'm at the mosque, I've got the Muslim ball in hand, and if I'm with my friends, I've got the English ball in hand. But each one of them isn't authentic. Each one of them is just expert mimicry. And what you end up doing is you get it wrong and you become a caricature of each of those, and that's why we have so many instances of mental health problems from people within this kind of a background, because you can't keep juggling these balls forever. I don't think, had I not had poetry, I wouldn't have been able to figure a lot of those questions out. I don't think, to be honest. It's a blessing as well, though.
Well, this is the thing.
Yeah.
You are you juggling in your poems? Because sometimes you talk about some poems about drinking in there and alcohol, which might have been with, being a sort of a Muslim, or because Somalia is something that this identity you've mentioned you have to sort of juggle, or you had to juggle, and obviously it makes its way into your poetry and it adds a texture to your poetry. And I wondered, how does Somalian culture, how does this consciously and unconsciously work its way into your poetry? And you've talked about juggling and things like that, but are you juggling when you put it on the page, or is it something a bit more articulated than juggling?
I think the other thing that poetry has given me the space to do is to develop those perspectives. So develop those separate perspectives, but also try and find a unity, and try and craft out of these disparate influences something that I can form a coherent whole out of. I keep coming back to this definition of being an intimate observer. But then I think through poetry, through a lot of self-reflection, I've come to a point where I embrace them all. Like, I embrace every last bit of it, and, the Somali language was only codified in the 70s. Most people had no need for a written text. The oral tradition was such that it was all encompassing. Everything was recorded in poetic form. That's the history, the culture, the laws, the conventions. Everything was put into meter, memorized, and transferred that way. And so the poet in Somali culture to this day holds a position second to none, really. Somebody who has developed their poetic skills and competencies is highly, highly, highly regarded. Far more highly regarded than we do here. Poetry in the UK or in the West really it's a province for those who admire it, usually those who write it. Poetry and culture are inseparable, in the Somali way of life. Wars have been stopped by poems and have been started by poems. But the space I choose to occupy as a poet is one that takes that role as being the observer and the critique of society, really. To do that, I have to be a critic of myself, to be able to see those things and to observe those things and to actually say something worthwhile, which I hope I can. But the perspectives are what give me a great deal of license to do that, I feel, because there's just not many people that have lived the kind of life I've lived. I've not been in Somalia now for 12 years, and being here now, it's just like it blows your mind. We might as well be on another planet sometimes.
There's an image British culture gives of Somalia. I mean, perhaps can give a bit of a picture for us of what life is like in Somalia.
It's a country that's organised tribally, has its positives and it has its negatives. I think with any socially organising mechanism, you're going to find positives and negatives. But this, the positives are really amazing. They've got a social security system that's thousands and thousands and thousands of years old. If somebody's ill, somebody needs help, they can rely on thousands of people around the world chipping in to come to their aid. It's a system called Qaran, and the Qaran is that you will pay into it whenever it's required of you, and if you ever need it, you can rely on everybody else paying it out. Somebody needs to go to hospital. The hospital they need is in India. We don't have great healthcare here, and I'm in Cardiff. Because we are tribal kin, I might get a call to say $50 and I'll send it. And someone else in Australia will get a call and someone else in Canada will get a call and we'll get that person to India and they'll get their treatment and we'll get them back. And so there's things like that. There's countless things like that, which just amaze me, in terms of how people are, how communitarian they are. And how generous they can be. They're some of the most generous people I've ever met, really. People who don't have a lot, but take pride in sharing what they've got. And there's the positives. And the negatives, I could go on all day about the negatives. It's tribal. It's one of the biggest problems of it. So.
I mean, for people in the UK, tribal isn't a word that sort of people, understand, I don't think, in the way of how it manifests as a social system. For listeners, you should just read Samatar's pamphlet because the way Somalia is weaved in, to just, you do get a bit of a picture of this country and how it has influenced your poetry. And it is fascinating to read at times. And this is what it's about, isn't it? This is what you talked about tension, you talked about juggling identities, but to put it, it comes out on the page, and it comes out on this page as this kind of glistening object that we can also look into and try and understand and learn a bit more about.
Thanks, man. A way to kind of define the tribalism for the audience would be to imagine that every family, so every house was the royal family, and every house thought they should be king or queen. That's what we've got.
That's a great analogy. I can imagine how much prestige that brings, but also how many kind of conflicts that could bring, actually.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's a nightmare. It's an absolute nightmare. There was and that was what a lot of the colonial agents, the kind of high officers or commandants in the Italian or the British or the French would always say, like, well, they're a country of kings, and how can you rule a country of kings? Everybody thinks every man is a king, and that's what tribal society will do to you, particularly when you've got a situation where no tribe has the coercive power over all the other tribes. Everybody thinks they're aristocracy. It creates so many tensions. It's very difficult to organize the people here. And then because of tribal fealty, when you've got corruption in politics, people will stand by their tribal leader at the expense of the country. We haven't reached a point where people are willing to sacrifice for the greater good. Yeah, it's still very tribal, and It's so unfortunate because they've got the resources here to do better, be better, and they've got the values and they've got the principles. They're just choosing not to adhere to them because of other values and other principles that are in conflict and seem to be overpowering them. There's a lot of work to be done, but I mean, the first time I came here was '97, and between '97 and now, and I've been 5 times altogether. Between '97 and now, they've made incredible strides forward. I mean, I'm talking about Somaliland. I've never been to Somalia. What we see on TV really is Mogadishu.
Yeah.
And even then, for people I know who've been there, again, it's not all Al-Shabaab and piracy, although they do feature. But Somaliland has no problem with piracy, no problems with, they've had several democratic elections, all observed by the EU and other partners. It's peaceful, My gran, she's a white woman, and she's been a few times. She went ages ago when it was pretty undeveloped, and she'd walk around fine, and yeah, it's just undeveloped because it's unrecognised, so they don't get any funding or support really. But people have built it, again through schemes like the Garan scheme and things like that. People don't. Yeah, they've built it. They protect it. They maintain the peace. So there's lots to celebrate. Even if I do get disappointed by some of the things I see, I don't want to be too pessimistic. There's lots. They're going in the right direction.
Samatar Elmi, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for joining me from Somaliland.
Thank you so much, Liam. It's been a privilege to participate. Thank you.
And that's it for this week's episode. Join me next time when I'm going to be joined by Jacqueline Bishop. She's going to be talking to me about her interview